When it was built in 2012, Divertical was the tallest water coaster in the world. The ride is located at Mirabilandia in Italy, stands 164 feet tall, absolutely massive, max speed almost 60 miles per hour, and ends in a gigantic splash, guaranteeing that you will get wet. Sounds pretty great, right? And it's built by Intamin. I mean, they've built some of the best coasters in the world. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, here's the thing. This might be one of the most bland, boring, and just plain underwhelming roller coasters I have ever ridden. In my Balder review, I talked about how it felt like that ride is having an identity crisis. It doesn't know whether it's a thrill ride or a family ride, and I feel like Divertical is the perfect example of that. You have a ride so huge, so intimidating, but just kind of ends up being slow and not very exciting. So that's the overview. I mean, let's get into a couple details here because there are some redeeming qualities to this ride. Probably the biggest and most obvious one is that on a hot day in Italy, man, is it gonna feel good to ride this thing. On the 2018 European coaster tour that I did, our day at Mirabilandia might have been the hottest day of the entire trip. So as you can imagine, we did not have a problem doing a water ride. Especially when walking up to it, it just looked so cool. They dedicated an entire plaza to this ride. There's all these flags flying. You can see multiple vehicles going around the track. They put the big final splashdown right where everyone can see it. So the ride just looks good. And one of the first main things that I want to mention here, when you board this ride vehicle, you have to bring everything that you have on you with you. So in my case, I had a big backpack full of course, camera equipment. Do I want to bring it on a big water ride? No, but guess what? I didn't have a choice. There's nowhere where you can store your loose articles. They just gotta go and ride with you. Now, because the ride isn't very extreme, you don't have to worry about the loose articles like flying off. If you put it at like the base of your feet, I mean, you're totally fine. The G-forces on this thing are not strong at all. But it just didn't make for a pleasant situation because then half the time I'm riding, the only thing I could focus on is trying not to get my camera stuff wet. So definitely was not a fan of that. When you depart out of the station, you start off on what feels like a log flume. You're in a trough in the ground, slowly making your way to the base of the lift. And this is probably the coolest part of the ride. I mean, an elevator lift all the way to the top of this thing is really, really cool. Those who remember Pilgrim's Plunge at Holiday World, that ride essentially had the same thing that this has. This is basically just a larger version of it where there's actually a full roller coaster section after that main drop. But I mean, what a way to kick off the experience. Economically is a great use of your space. And you're gonna need a lot of space for this ride because up ahead you have a very shallow first drop. We have an angle of descent of 45 degrees. That isn't even a drop, that is a ramp. I'm not really sure what they were thinking when they did that because that first drop does absolutely nothing but build up some speed. Maybe that was the point, but in no way does it feel thrilling. You don't feel any positive or negative G-forces. You're just gradually going down, thinking that you're about to get soaked by a big splash, but psych, you don't. Which is fine. I mean, the goal is that you get wet at the end of the ride, but it's a little strange that the big drop doesn't provide the biggest splash. Now, the reason for it is because when you have a big splash, it also doubles as brakes. And because there is a roller coaster portion of the ride after this drop, you can't just lose all your momentum by having this gigantic splash. Because right after that drop, you go into a quote-unquote airtime hill. Surprise, surprise, there is no airtime. And this is the part of the ride that really I have mixed feelings about. Because on one hand, it's good that they decided to lengthen that ride experience that you would have gotten had this just been normal Pilgrim's Plunge. They lengthened it and added this whole roller coaster section. That's great. But it just doesn't do anything. It was slow. It felt like you were meandering around. It was kind of shaky, to be honest, so it wasn't even totally smooth. The whole train was just jittering on the track the entire ride, and so there just wasn't really anything impressive there. It's just killing time until you go to the main splashdown, which all things considered, I mean, it is a pretty good splash at the end of the ride. As with most water rides, depending on where you're sitting, that will decide how wet you get. We saw some people sit in the very front row and not get drenched, but some people towards the back did. So I'm sure it depends on weight or just luck of the draw. But either way, because it was really hot out when we went, we dried off fairly quickly anyway, so it was not a big deal. But all in all, I was just not very impressed with this ride. It actually kind of surprised me that they were able to clone this and build this at a few other parks around the world. Probably the most well-known clone of this is located at Energylandia. That's called Speed, which is ironic because if it's anything like Divertical, you don't feel very much speed on this ride. I think the best thing about this coaster is that if you're looking for a water ride, you got that, and it's also a roller coaster. So it just combines two popular ride types. And for the general public, I'm sure they love it. Even though the first drop totally sucks, the sheer height of this thing is really intimidating. The ride is enormous, so yeah, it's totally going to be popular. When we went to Mirabilandia, this had a longer line than Katoon, which is a B&M invert. I mean, you can make an argument it's a capacity thing, but no, there were just a lot more people in general over at this ride. So in that regard, I don't blame parks for doing it, but going back to the idea of an identity crisis, I feel like when thrill seekers see that height, they're gonna want to ride it and then just be underwhelmed by the ride experience. But then the kids that want a water ride will be too scared to do it, even though the actual experience is fairly mild and they'd totally be able to handle it. That's probably one of the biggest issues with this thing. I'm not sure what the goal of this ride is, because I don't feel like it's to thrill anyone. If you want that, go ride iSpeed next door. So for Divertical's final score, I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10. I think it's pretty stupid, honestly. I'm sorry if you really love this. Actually, I'd love to hear why down in the comments below, what you think of this. I'm totally open to hearing other people's point of views, but as for me, there wasn't a whole lot of redeeming factors for this coaster. I didn't have any interest in rewriting it, even though it was really hot out, and I'm sure it would have felt refreshing, but it wasn't worth waiting in line again, and 90% of the actual ride just didn't do anything for me. But anyways, that's gonna be my review of Divertical at Mirabilandia. If you've ridden this or one of its clones around the world, please let me know down below, and of course stay tuned for more coaster reviews here at Coaster Studios, and I'll see you next time.